I wanted to take just a few moments to reflect on the presidential election. It's something that's still very much in the forefront of everybody's minds these days, and especially with the clients that I work with, which are empathetic and purpose driven women leaders, many of whom just feel really a sense of despair and hopelessness as they look forward into the new year and what the next 4 years may look like. And I also have friends that come to me and just ask for either the lens through which I am interpreting this election or what my mental state is or how I'm feeling or explaining some of the dynamics and the votership that happened in this particular election. So I did want to spend some time and share with you some of my thoughts, in particular related to a really important aspect of my research, which is called embodied leadership. Embodied leadership is not so much about the use of our bodies sort of intentionally in the space of leadership, but how within each of our own lived experiences we perceive others. So this is called embodied perception. This comes out of the work of the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, whose work I feel is in some ways underappreciated and in many cases unheard of and unknown. But in the case of leadership and the relationship between leaders and followers, it's a really important lens through which to understand, in this case, the presidential election. So when we think about who we might vote for or who we might trust as a leader, we look at a couple of different areas. The surface, for example, issues of policy and how we agree on paper may determine how we perceive a particular leader. There's also the aspect of the leader's persona. We talk about charismatic leadership. That's oftentimes something that very much influences people's ability to feel drawn to a leader and can lead to some very dangerous outcomes that as we've seen throughout history. But there's also the deep psychology of the follower or voter themselves and the ways in which they determine who is someone that they trust, who is someone they identify with, and who they may feel safe with. And those determinations don't happen at a cognitive or rational level as those policy questions might occur. The perceptions that we have of others, in particular other leaders, comes from a deep place of internal psychology and the way we experience our own lives in our own bodies. And so perception is one of the key determining elements of how people are going to vote, in this case, in an election. And very little is known about the interiority of each person who's going to make those voting decisions. And so there's a lot of turmoil right now where strategists are asking themselves, what happened? How did Harris lose this election? How did Trump win this election? Based on some of the determining factors people were looking at in the months leading up to the election. But I think something that's being really, underlooked and under-scrutinized is the role of this piece of embodied perception. And I think it will be helpful moving forward when we are having conversations with people with whom we may not agree with, or during those holiday gatherings when you're across the table from someone who feels completely polar opposite in terms of the outcome of this election. Understanding the deep psychology that determines voter trends, I think will help humanize this experience in a way that it doesn't dilute the issues and it doesn't sort of create a toxic positivity or hopefulness around the election, but I think allows us to be able to feel like we can move forward and perhaps build alliances and kind of collaborations where we may not have felt that was possible before. So the two categories of votership that I'm interested in looking at with people who maybe more generally voted for Trump in this election are men who I would describe as emasculated men, whether economically they are disempowered or socially, feeling very isolated, a lack of opportunity, a lack of agency in their life, were predominantly more attracted to Trump as a candidate than Harris. And that very much points to this topic of embodied perception, where if you're coming from a place of disempowerment as a man and see, again, this charismatic male figure who has a great deal of gravitas and power and empowerment, one may feel that voting for that individual will enable want to feel a piece of that empowerment. Regardless of the policies that are put into place economically or in terms of job security, that feeling of confidence that that male voter has for someone like Trump very much would determine the decision to vote for him, regardless of whether that comes from a place of rational decision making. Perhaps a policy offered by the other candidate really would have promoted more economic stability for that voter. But the feeling, again, that gut feeling that one has toward a leader and the confidence that they have in that leader is very much based in an internal lived experience of that person's social location. The other demographic that I'm very interested in are white women voters of middle class economic standing, working class, who more than previous elections voted for the Republican ticket. And I think there's a lot of blame, in particular within feminist activist circles, why those women would vote against their gender. And I think that's a really problematic stance to be in because we don't know the interior decision-making elements that cause someone to vote in a certain way. And I think it's unfair also to assume or to demand or expect all women to vote for their gender. We don't do the same for men. In fact, there were a huge amount of men who voted for Harris and, of course, did not vote for their gender. So why would we place that same expectation on women? What I think is important to do is to look at the lived experience of those women voters who did vote for Trump and ask what was it in their life that made them feel that that was a more trustworthy candidate. It's not that they perhaps turned away from Harris or turned away from the causes that would improve their lives as women, but there was some kind of a pull or a gut feeling toward the Trump campaign that made them feel more confident. Again, on the surface level, it could have been that economic package that was being offered, regardless of whether it will come to fruition. But there's a deep element similar to emasculated men and disempowered men. If you have women who are struggling to have voice, agency, and choice in their life, and in some cases, there's an experience known as internalized sexism, where ultimately that woman will feel more empowered by aligning herself with a stronger patriarchal figure than identifying herself with a woman leader such as Harris. And again, that's really difficult to observe if you are a feminist political activist or someone who was really promoting the policies. For example, reproductive choice was a big one. To see women voting against that was really, really heartbreaking. But again, this topic of embodied leadership helps us to see that there are subconscious and more tacit elements of voter decision-making that are at play here. And especially when we're talking about disempowered economically or disempowered socially, voters who feel that they don't have agency, are feeling desperate in their life, their ability to be attracted by this charismatic leader and sort of powerful patriarchal figure that Trump embodies was for them the best decision at the end of the day. And obviously, time will tell whether they feel that was the right decision. But I think in order to move forward during this time of division, I think it's important to find still the commonalities between these two sides instead of seeing them as across the board oppositional toward each other. The votership have a lot of commonality, even if they voted differently at the voting booth. And so my approach moving forward, instead of feeling paralyzed in despair and grief, is to focus on the issues that I am most passionate about, which obviously with my research and my coaching work is to empower purpose-driven and empathetic women to be able to live their lives more fully and more value-aligned with their core sense of self, leaving toxic relationships, leaving toxic workplaces, and really carving out that path that's most self-actualized and reflective of who their true sense of self is. I'm also going to really put more energy into the specific policy issues and areas that I'm most passionate about. There's a lot of discussion about how abortion was framed during this election, and I still feel so deeply passionate about reproductive rights, reproductive choice, and reproductive freedom. The fact that the next 4 years may see disastrous attacks on those freedoms, I'm going to put my energy into mobilizing the kind of work that I've done in my life in the past, working for Planned Parenthood, working for reproductive rights coalitions in New York State, and bring that back into the forefront as something that I'm really passionate about. And if you've seen some of my other content in the past couple of days, finding and reclaiming those areas of life that give you the greatest sense of passion and conviction and positivity to be able to move through this next season